Water surged over the HOA office parking lot like a biblical reckoning, submerging their smug little golf carts under 3 feet of muddy retribution. The once pristine clubhouse now sat in the center of a growing swamp, the marble tiles of their community excellence foyer glistening with frog spawn and algae. Karen, the HOA president, stood barefoot on a folding table, clutching her ruined heels like the Titanic's final passenger, shrieking about how this wasn't supposed to happen. But I just watched, arms crossed, boots dry on my porch uphill, sipping coffee as my creek they buried in concrete, rose to reclaim everything they had built. What happens when you ignore the land and try to punish the man who protects it? They called it unauthorized drainage modification. I called it what it really was, an assault on the land, a desecration of something ancient and alive. See, the creek wasn't just water to me. It wasn't a ditch, or a nuisance, or some forgettable little runoff the way those HOA clipboard tyrants like to describe it. That creek had been running through my property for as long as anyone could remember. It cut through the low hills like a vein, curved like it knew the language of the land. My grandfather used to say the creek whispered before a storm, and I believed him. It changed color with the seasons. Frogs came in the spring, dragonflies in summer, deer in the fall. It was life, movement, balance, and it kept our land from turning into a basin of rot and mildew. That's what made it so sacred. And that's exactly why they couldn't stand it. The HOA never liked my property. It sat at the north edge of the neighborhood, a little higher in elevation, with old trees and unmanicured wildflower patches. My house wasn't HOA built. I'd inherited it, modernized it with my own hands, kept it standing solid with actual care instead of cheap labor and beige vinyl siding. And the creek, well, that was the thorn in their side from day one. It didn't fit their hydrological harmony initiative. Karen, the HOA president, said that in the meeting with a straight face, hydrological harmony. Like she was some kind of water priestess ordained by bureaucracy. Her hair was helmet perfect, her eyebrows drawn in a semi-permanent scowl, and her clipboard always tucked against her chest like a badge of holy authority. She'd been gunning for my creek since the first year I stopped attending the HOA meetings. I guess she didn't like being ignored. The letters started small. Concerns about open water hazards, about potential breeding zones for disease vectors, about non-conforming wetland features. That last one made me laugh so hard I nearly framed it. But it escalated fast. They held an emergency session without me present. I only found out because a neighbor sent me a photo of Karen standing beside a large easel covered in printouts of satellite maps. My creek had a red X drawn through it in every photo. Apparently, the HOA had petitioned the county stormwater division and lied, told them I'd illegally rerouted the natural drainage, that I was causing erosion downstream, that my property posed a flood risk to the homes below. Total fabrication. But here's the kicker. Those homes below? They'd been built right up against the old runoff basin the creek used to feed into before developers paved over it. They filled in the natural floodplain. I tried to warn them back when construction started. Nobody listened. One morning, I walked outside and saw it, the crew. Backhoes, concrete mixers, and a team of contractors in safety vests standing around my creek bed like it was a pothole to be patched. Karen was there, smiling like she'd just won a lawsuit she didn't have to pay for. I shouted. I demanded answers. They told me they had the permits. I asked to see them. Karen handed me a stack of papers, smug as ever. I flipped through them, jaw clenched. The signatures were real, but my name wasn't on a single page. They'd labeled it OA Common Drainage Channel 6 and got the work approved through a loophole in the county code that allowed community-managed storm infrastructure to be altered without homeowner consent if it was within regulated authority. My creek wasn't a drainage ditch, but they'd reclassified it in a county meeting I wasn't even told about. Karen watched me like she was waiting for a meltdown. I didn't give her one. I just stood there. Watched. Memorized every inch of the destruction as they poured concrete over the rocks, rerouted the flow through a plastic pipe, and filled in the rest with crushed gravel. They paved over the soul of the land. They smothered it in silence. The birds stopped coming. A week later, I got the fine in the mail. 300, zero, not a typo, 300 grand. The letter said I was being held liable for the cost of restoration and compliance, as well as negligent alteration of community infrastructure and refusal to acknowledge mandatory hydrological adjustment orders. I nearly choked. They charged me for the creek they destroyed, claimed I had altered its flow by maintaining it, that I'd refused water management assistance, as if their concrete tomb was a helping hand. It was so absurd, so backward, so brutally arrogant, I didn't know whether to scream or laugh. But I did neither. I just poured a mug of black coffee, walked down to where the creek used to babble in the morning light, and stood in the silence. I could still see the ghosts of water trails along the bank. Dragonflies flitting over dry gravel. A frog sitting on a rock that was no longer beside water. I stayed there until the sun went down. The next few weeks were war by paper, letters, emails, phone calls from the HOA's lawyer. They claimed I had caused unnecessary opposition, that if I simply accepted the terms and paid the fine, they could consider waiving further legal proceedings. I didn't reply. I let them stew. Then the threats came. They'd escalate to collections. They'd place a lien on my home, take me to civil court, make an example out of me. I posted the fine on my fridge with a magnet shaped like a trout. Every morning I looked at it while I made breakfast, and every morning I smiled a little colder. Karen wasn't subtle. She walked past my house twice a day now. Once in the morning with her little HOA clipboard, pretending to inspect lawns, and once in the evening to check lighting ordinances. She'd pause near the edge of my property, just before where the creek used to flow. I'd be on the porch, boots up on the railing, cup in hand, just staring back. We never spoke, but the message was clear. She thought she'd buried me with that concrete, thought I'd crumble like the soft-skulled board members who rubber-stamped her every demand. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my creek wasn't dead. It was patient. And it had friends in places deeper than storm drains and cement channels. They didn't know what that water meant, but they were about to learn. It started small, the way most warnings from the land do. Not with a bang or a scream, but a slow, creeping unease, subtle shifts under your boots, a strange smell in the morning air, a silence where birdsong used to be. 2 weeks after they buried my creek, the ground stopped soaking in the morning dew. I walked across the field one morning and the soil squished. Not the satisfying give of rich earth, but a bloated, sour kind of mush, like the land was choking on its own breath. My boots sank in places they never had before. Up near my house, everything stayed firm because I'd reinforced the uphill slope years ago, redirected excess runoff naturally. But downhill, closer to the main development, I saw the first crack. Literally. The sidewalk outside Lot 8 split down the center like a seam tearing open. At first, they blamed a delivery truck. Heavy axle weight, they said. But I knew better. The creek had run parallel to that street, absorbing storm runoff, snow melt, even the occasional overflow from upstairs irrigation systems. It wasn't just water, it was a pressure valve. They'd sealed it shut, and now the pressure was building. Karen didn't see it. Or maybe she did and pretended not to. That was her specialty, pretending. Pretending she was in control. Pretending she understood soil mechanics because she once took a weekend course on xeriscaping. Pretending she was working for the neighborhood while she stuffed board positions with her friends and pressured realtors into HOA-friendly sales contracts. The power had gone to her head years ago. The problem was, the land didn't care about power. It only cared about balance. And it was already starting to push back. Foundation cracks became a common conversation on the Nextdoor group. First, the Myers posted about their garage door not closing flush anymore. Then the lists claimed their back patio had begun to settle strangely. Within a month, 5 different houses had visible structural fractures, all on the side of the neighborhood where the creek once fed the runoff basin. Karen dismissed every concern. "Old concrete shifts," she said in one message. "This is normal aging of materials." That might have worked if it weren't for the mold. By late May, the neighborhood smelled wrong. musty, heavy. You could walk down Glenway Drive and tell just by the air which homes were suffering. Basements had begun to sweat. Paint peeled. Air conditioners failed from overuse. One family went on vacation and returned to find their guest bedroom walls furred over with black mold. That one made the local paper. Karen went into full PR mode, calling it an isolated incident, blaming poor insulation. But the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. I watched from my porch as arguments broke out on the sidewalk. Heated, red-faced debates about whether to file a class action suit against the HOA. At first, it was just whispers. But then someone spray-painted "Concrete Creek Mold Death" on the HOA clubhouse fence. Karen had it removed the next morning, but the message had sunk in. The land remembered what had been taken, and now the people were starting to remember too. I started documenting everything. Not just the mold or the cracks, but the wildlife patterns, the water table changes, even the smell of the earth on different days. I dug out my grandfather's old journals and compared his creek maps to the current county surveys. Sure enough, I found the original runoff chart, the one showing that Mike Creek had been the primary drain channel for this entire ridge for over 70 years. A protected watershed, too. Until Karen and her clipboard cult quietly changed the zoning status by lobbying a county commissioner with HOA funds. I dug further. Found financial reports with odd line items. Stormwater beautification, 19,000. Drainage optimization study, 11,500. But no receipts, no contractor names. I printed them all, photographed them, stored copies in encrypted folders and old-school manila envelopes. Karen thought she'd silenced me with concrete and fines, but all she did was give me a mission. The land wasn't done speaking. I was going to make sure someone heard it. The tension in the neighborhood turned physical by early June. The Carters, who lived closest to the old flood basin, had their entire backyard turned into what looked like a marsh. Their grass died. Their dog got sick. They asked the HOA for assistance with drainage. Karen sent them a letter stating that residents are responsible for all personal irrigation issues. 2 days later, a delivery driver slipped on the algae-covered path leading to their porch. Karen fined them $300 for creating a slip hazard. That's when the signs started going up, literal ones. O kills land. Restore the creek. Karen is the flood. They appeared overnight on fences, mailboxes, stuck into lawns with garden stakes. Karen removed them every morning. By evening, new ones would appear. This wasn't organized rebellion. It was something wilder, something deeper, a current running through the community like the water used to. You could feel it in the air. I kept quiet, said nothing on the message boards, attended no meetings. Karen mistook my silence for retreat. But I was just watching, logging every rainfall, measuring saturation levels with old probes. Using aerial drone shots to track the spreading damp zone beneath the surface, I marked every home showing signs of mold or soil shift. The map looked like a bruise spreading outward from the concrete scar they'd poured over my creek. And I knew it was only going to get worse. You don't plug a pressure valve and walk away. You don't ignore the breathing system of the land and expect it to behave. Especially not in June, especially not with storm season coming. I installed my barriers quietly. No contractors, no permits. Just me, some tools, and the knowledge passed down from men who'd worked this land before I was born. Reinforced the slope behind my house with gravel channels and reinforced mesh, dug out a runoff catchment beneath the shed, disguised with native stone. Lined the tree rows with drainage trenches disguised as aesthetic edging. Karen had no idea. She was too busy fining people for unauthorized vegetable gardens and arguing with the Carters about whether cattails qualified as invasive plant matter. She never once thought to check the one property she thought she'd already beaten. On the summer solstice, I stood at the edge of the concrete grave where my creek used to sing. The sky was purple with coming rain. Humid, heavy, and I knew the land was ready. The water was coming. The concrete would not hold, and the HOA had no idea what they'd buried. The storm didn't announce itself with thunder. It wasn't dramatic at first. No lighting crack, no shrieking wind. It started with a sky too still, too quiet. A heavy, bloated ceiling of gray that hovered over the neighborhood like a held breath. I knew that sky. I'd seen it before. In the mountains during flash flood season. In the valleys after a long drought when the soil was too dry to soak up what was coming. It wasn't the kind of storm you wait out. It was the kind that rewrites the ground. I stood on my porch that morning and smelled it. Ozone, mud, and something else. Something metallic, like the scent of a loaded gun. I knew exactly what was about to happen. The creek they murdered was coming back, and it was not coming gently. The rain came fast. Not a sprinkle, not a drizzle, full saturation within minutes. The kind of downpour that erases rooftops in a haze. It was the third storm that week, but this one had teeth. The soil was already bloated from the last two. Without my creek to carry the pressure off the ridge, the water had nowhere to go. I watched it roll over the pavement, like a tide, looking for home. Within 20 minutes, Glenway Drive was gone. It was a river now. Water swirling up past curbs, carrying mulch, garden ornaments, trash cans like driftwood. At first, people stayed calm. They always do in the beginning. Just a heavy storm, someone posted. The drains will catch up. But there were no drains. Not anymore. Karen's concrete correction had rerouted everything. And now the land was correcting her. By hour 2, yards were swamps. The hedges on Maple Court were halfway underwater. Children's bikes floated sideways in flooded driveways. The Myers' backyard shed, the same one they'd just built last summer, slipped off its foundation and began to tilt like a sinking ship. Water pushed through garage doors like it had a grudge. The Carters' lawn exploded into a geyser, their sump pump giving up with a mechanical wheeze loud enough to be heard from 2 blocks over. I didn't need to check my watch or the weather radar. I knew exactly what stage we were in. This wasn't backup. This wasn't inconvenience. This was land vengeance, and it had only just begun. Meanwhile, my property remained bone dry. The barriers I built did exactly what they were designed to. The water rolled off the slope behind my shed, funneled cleanly into the catchment pit I'd buried months ago. The runoff drained down the mesh-lined trenches, away from my home, into the gravel-laced pit that mimicked what the creek used to do naturally. The old oaks swayed, but the soil beneath them held. No slides. No bogging. Just the slow, purposeful draining of a system that respected the land's voice. I stood there, dry boots planted firm, watching as every house downhill was swallowed up in chaos. The ones who laughed when I warned them. The ones who called my creek a nuisance. The ones who voted for hydrological modernization. Now they were on Facebook, begging for sandbags. Karen was nowhere to be seen at first. Her usual HOA blasts went silent. The group chat turned into a panicked frenzy. Messages about soaked basements, electrical shorts, drowned gardens. Someone posted a photo of their living room underwater. The caption read, "Anyone else having serious issues?" No reply. Another neighbor reported that their entire retaining wall had collapsed into their neighbor's pool. Then came the photos. Cars half submerged. A trampoline floating across the greenbelt. A section of sidewalk cracked wide open like a broken jaw. Still no Karen. That silence told me everything. She wasn't leading. She was hiding, waiting for the storm to pass so she could spin the narrative. But this wasn't the kind of disaster you could gaslight away. The land had receipts. Around sunset, emergency vehicles began circling the outer edges of the development. Too little, too late. The roads were impassable. The neighborhood's only 2 exit points were flooded waist-deep. One resident tried to drive through and stalled in the middle, had to climb out the window and wade back barefoot, their toddler crying from the back seat. That photo made the local news. The headline read, "Private HOA Neighborhood Paralyzed by Flash Floods." But the reporters hadn't yet heard the best part. Not until I called them. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because someone needed to tell the truth. I sent them the county maps, the original water flow charts, the new permits signed off by HOA attorneys under false classification. I sent drone footage, before and after shots. One showing the creek as it once was, alive and curving like a signature across the land. the other showing the cold gray scar of poured concrete. I highlighted the elevation lines, showed how the natural flow had been cut off, how every flooded home was in what used to be the watershed basin. I included Karen's public statements, her beautification plan PDF where she called the creek an aesthetic hindrance. I emailed it all to a local hydrologist I knew from a land conservation nonprofit. The reply was quick. This is criminally negligent, and if anyone died, it would be manslaughter. By morning, the flood had reached its peak. People began evacuating in canoes and inflatable rafts. One couple carried their dogs out in laundry baskets. The power went out in 12 homes due to water damage. The HOA clubhouse, the pride and joy of Karen's little empire, was under 4 feet of water. The HOA president parking spot was a pond. The flagpole had tilted at a precarious angle, the flag torn and flapping like a white rag of surrender. Still, the HOA released an official statement. I read it aloud on my porch. We regret the severe weather event that has affected our community. This appears to be a highly unusual and unpredictable occurrence, a result of unprecedented rainfall levels, and not due to any specific landscaping choice. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. That afternoon, the county showed up. Not one guy in a truck either, a full team. Environmental engineers, inspectors, even someone from the Army Corps of Engineers. They set up orange cones, parked at the only dry spot they could find, my property. When they knocked on my door, I was already waiting with the documents. The lead engineer, a woman named Patrice, took one look at my files and whistled low. So they buried a functional creek, claimed it was storm drain infrastructure, then fined you for not agreeing? I nodded. She scanned the before and after aerial photos. Jesus, this isn't runoff mismanagement. This is hydrological sabotage. She wasn't being dramatic. When they tested the flow sensors and reviewed the water table spikes, her team found the numbers had been spiking for weeks. The storm hadn't caused the flood. The concrete had. The land had tried to hold back. But Karen's vanity project turned it into a dam with no outlet. Within hours, the engineers placed a temporary stop order on all HOA-controlled maintenance activities. They flagged the concrete creek bed as environmentally non-compliant. That meant everything was about to get real expensive. County officials started taking statements, and not just from me. Neighbors came forward, people I hadn't spoken to in months. People who once voted to have my land beautified. Now, they were quoting the damage costs. Cracked foundations, mold abatement, ruined furniture, drowned HVAC systems. Karen tried to reappear during a county inspection, stepped out of her Range Rover in rubber boots like she was the brave leader emerging to save her people. But the county team ignored her completely. She wasn't on the permits. She wasn't licensed. And now, she wasn't in control. By nightfall, the reporters had arrived, not just local ones. State news trucks, a regional environmental blog, even a freelance docuseries guy with a camera rig who asked if I'd be willing to talk about how grassroots homeowners could protect natural water systems. I told him sure, but only after I checked the trenches one more time. My land was still draining cleanly. My house was untouched, my boots were dry, and the creek, though still buried in concrete, had spoken. Through force, through water, through the unforgiving, patient rage of a land ignored too long. Karen had underestimated me. But worse, she'd underestimated the land. And now, the flood had only spoken once. It hadn't yet screamed. That part was still coming. The land never forgets. It remembers every cut, every concrete scar, every insult forced on its skin by people who thought power gave them permanence. And when the land remembers, it demands justice, not always with fire or quake, but with something far more precise. Water. Water doesn't scream, it surrounds, it infiltrates. It finds the cracks you swore were sealed and slips through until the very foundation beneath you surrenders. The HOA had buried my creek and tried to bury me with it. But the water rose, and now, so did I, with paperwork, drone footage, and a case that stretched from local negligence to full-blown federal disaster. The Army Corps of Engineers was the first to escalate. The inspection report they issued after 3 days on-site was damning, clinical, and absolute. I got a copy because I'd been listed as the complainant of record. That's what they called me. I called it poetic. The report detailed how a protected intermittent stream had been illegally reclassified, diverted, and contained via concrete stabilization without adherence to Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Those weren't Karen's HOA buzzwords. Those were federal law violations. And when the Corps finds unauthorized development in a riparian corridor, especially one that leads to downstream public waterways, it doesn't slap wrists. It swings a wrecking ball. They brought FEMA in next. FEMA's interest wasn't water. It was risk. When they saw the neighborhood's storm path maps, paired with my drone footage showing how the flow had been dammed and redirected, their analysts nearly foamed at the mouth. Every home below the old creek path was now considered Zone AE, high-risk floodplain, the kind that requires mandatory federal flood insurance, elevated rebuilds, and, most importantly, public notice. Karen had single-handedly pushed the entire HOA subdivision into a legal and financial sinkhole, and I had the paper trail to prove it. When I forwarded FEMA the emails, minutes, and HOA newsletters referencing the hydrological modernization plan, their lawyers requested a formal deposition, not just mine, Karen's, under oath. The meeting was held at the county building. Karen showed up in a beige pantsuit with pearl earrings, trying to project control. But her face betrayed something new. Fear. The FEMA agents didn't waste time. They brought out the maps, the satellite photos, the altered zoning language. They asked why no environmental impact study had been submitted before altering a federally recognized watercourse. Karen fumbled. Said the HOA believed it was aesthetic landscaping. The FEMA official deadpanned. "Are you licensed to determine hydrological zoning classifications, ma'am?" Karen blinked. Swallowed. "No." "Then you'll be happy to know we're forwarding this entire case to the EPA." That was the first time her hands visibly shook. The EPA came with the force of nature Karen tried to suppress. Their fine structure alone would have bankrupted a mid-sized business. 0 per day of non-compliance since the creek was buried. Backdated 4 months. Over $6 million in penalties. And that was just the federal side. The State Water Board tacked on another $300,000 for unlawful modification of protected waters. The county demanded reimbursement for the emergency response costs. The insurance companies pulled out. And the homeowners? They sued the HOA as a collective, over 40 plaintiffs. Karen tried to claim executive immunity under her board position. But the EPA had already pierced that illusion. She'd signed the original work orders herself. She'd labeled the creek non-essential infrastructure. She'd dismissed my documented objections as resistance to community progress. The lawsuit pinned her as the architect of negligence. Within 3 weeks, Karen filed for personal bankruptcy. Her Range Rover disappeared. Her fake smile vanished from the group chat. She stopped walking the neighborhood entirely. Her once pristine home, corner lot, marble planter boxes, columns like a courthouse, went dark. For sale, signs popped up on at least a dozen lawns. But no one was buying. The whole subdivision was now officially listed on FEMA's flood hazard database. Property values plummeted by 62%. Lenders froze refinancing. Homeowners screamed in the forums, blamed the board, blamed the weather, blamed government overreach. But not me, not once. Because they knew. I had warned them. The land had warned them. They poured concrete over a living thing and expected gratitude. What they got was judgment, cold, wet, and fully documented. And the HOA office? Oh, I bought it, not through some petty auction or backdoor dealing, no. I waited until the HOA itself was forced to liquidate assets to cover their legal fees. The clubhouse went first. That tacky building they once used to fine people for mailbox designs now had a foot of standing water in its basement. Mold bloomed across the ceiling like black lace. I offered cash, no inspection, and closed the sale in 5 days. Karen's former office, her sanctum of power, was now mine, and I didn't change a thing. Not right away. I left the faded community board pinned with old event flyers. I kept the crooked HOA Excellence Award plaque bolted to the wall. I even left the frame that once held Karen's portrait, now empty. What I did add was simple. I flooded the lower half of the building and turned it into a frog sanctuary. It started as a joke. A friend dared me to repurpose it into a wetlands exhibit, but the irony was too perfect to pass up. I filed for nonprofit status. Called it Creek Rebirth Conservatory. Local schools began scheduling field trips. Environmental groups donated benches and signage. And the frogs, dozens of them, moved in like they'd been waiting. The building Karen had used to erase the creek was now its temple. Every croak echoed like a hymn, every lily pad a victory. And I made sure the EPA inspector who issued the final citation came to the ribbon cutting. She gave a little speech, smiled at me when she saw the hydrological harmony banner I'd nailed upside down over the entryway. Inside my new office, right above the old desk Karen used to write her petty fines, I framed something special. Her eviction notice, issued by the county, dated and signed. Failure to comply with legal restitution for environmental damages. That was her legacy now, not control, not power, but a cautionary tale pinned to the wall of a place teeming with life she once tried to drown in cement. I sip my coffee every morning on the porch, overlooking what's left of the neighborhood. My land is peaceful. The creek runs again, not wild, but steady. Thanks to the restoration team the EPA brought in using the fines from the HOA lawsuit. Dragonflies dance across the water. Deer have returned. Even the foxes show up now and then, as if to check on me. The homes below are mostly vacant. Foreclosures, fire sales, abandoned plans. The new zoning restrictions require that all future construction include flood mitigation and hydrological review. In other words, no more concrete fantasies. Karen moved out in the middle of the night. I saw her car go. No fanfare, no goodbye. Just a flash of headlights disappearing down the only dry road in the area. Mine. She doesn't know it yet, but a picture of her Range Rover taken the morning after the storm sits on the wall of the frog sanctuary right next to the before and after satellite photos. Children point at it on field trips and ask, "Who's that?" And I tell them, "That's someone who thought she could outrun water." The creek lives. The land breathes. And I don't just live here anymore. I own this ending.